we now have the power to change dramatically the human species, for good or for bad. A look at the first step, Juan Enriquez.
All right. Let's see if we can't have some fun with this. Let's wander up to the first slide, please. So the question is, should we evolve ourselves? And part of what's happening is we're beginning to take direct and deliberate control over evolution. And I actually mean that in literal terms. So about half of what lives and dies on Earth is what we choose. It's not nature choosing it. We want our cats over here, we want our pigs over here, we want our roses over here, our soybeans over here, our cities over here. We don't want too many snakes, except in Washington. And so as you're doing this stuff, and as you're watching this stuff, what you're really doing is you're saying, if we left this stuff fallow, then you'd have a completely different ecosystem. And that means that we are creating a parallel evolutionary framework where nature would pick this, and we're picking this. And that's about half of life on Earth. And as we do that, one of the things that we're changing is our bodies. And let me give you an idea of how we're doing this. So the concept of an iron fist comes from a German count that loved to fight. And after a series of fights, he had an arm cut off, and he decided, I don't want to quit fighting, so he simply went and made himself an iron fist and kept fighting. And we've been evolving these prosthetics, so they're getting more and more sophisticated. They're getting more and more able, so now you have prosthetics that allow you to hold a soft-boiled egg and do a whole series of things. They're really getting very sophisticated, but something else is happening. Prosthetics have moved from nice-to-have to must-haves. Because as you begin to put prosthetics inside the body, especially things like pacemakers, then one of the things that happens is, if this thing fails, you die. And at that point, a prosthetic isn't, a peg leg that's useful when you get out of bed. At that point, a prosthetic becomes an integral part of your body. And so we're beginning to coexist with these things, and as they get more and more sophisticated, you get these extraordinary scientists like Hugh Hare at the MIT Media Lab, who lost both of his legs in a climbing accident, and is basically creating not a 5-car garage, but a 5-foot garage. So he goes out and he decides how tall does he want to be that day? What is he going to do? Is he going to be climbing? Is he going to be running? Is he going to be on his feet for a long time? And these things are getting more and more sophisticated. So you're now beginning to see people who are running in the Paralympics who are too advantaged, right? So we're moving from this concept of disabled to advantaged. And in the Brazilian Olympics, the people running the 800 in the Paralympics would have beaten the people who got the finals of the regular Olympics. So these prosthetics are moving quickly to the point where it almost starts looking like a Tommy John surgery, where people begin to voluntarily do things to their bodies that they otherwise wouldn't do. And so Jacobson and Boyden and Hare are creating the Center for Extreme Bionics. And as you begin to think about that stuff, Ed's beginning to think about how you use optogenetics. He's the co-discoverer of optogenetics, to begin to connect the brain directly to the limb. And the interesting thing there is how fast your body reacts depends on how thick your nerves are. So once you begin to connect the brain directly to the limb through a fiber optic nerve, that means your reaction time can go up by 10-fold or 20-fold or 50-fold. And eventually you may be able to step out of the path of a speeding bullet if you can see the muzzle flash far away. Completely changes human reaction times. Completely changes what your body can do and how your body reacts. And you're also beginning to see this with hearing aids, right? So your great-grandparents had these cones, and they'd kind of use the cones, and then your grandparents had these big boxes that would squawk at odd times during dinner, and they'd adjust them. And your parents probably have these little hearing aids that you can't see. They're almost invisible. But now you're beginning to put cochlear implants into people who are deaf. And at first, It was hard for them to hear conversations, and then they could hear 60% of the conversations, and then 70% of the conversations. And now they can hear about as well as you and I can. But our hearing is evolving very slowly. Their hearing is not. So pretty soon, they're going to be able to focus the conversation and hear the conversation going on at that table. Or they'll be able to hear in perfect pitch. Or they'll be able to take phone calls through their things. Or they'll be able to hear what dogs are saying and what dolphins are saying. And it's conceivable that within a decade or two, you will not be hired by a symphony orchestra unless if you have an implant. You might start to see the similar trend that's happening in the Olympics. Eyes are about a decade or two behind that. But it wouldn't shock me if, my kids at some point had eyes that could see in infrared, or eyes that could see in ultraviolet, or eyes that could focus out a long way. And this whole integration of prosthetics and the body is something that's happening pretty quickly. So it's a reasonable question to ask, what are human beings going to look like in a century or two? And as you're thinking about redesigning human beings, of course, there's Yogi Berra talking about predictions and why they're so hard. But you don't have to predict. What you can do is you can take current trends and say, what happens as this continues to evolve? So this wonderful man, Tony Atala, started thinking about teeth. All of you were born with no teeth. And I can tell you your mothers were very grateful. And then you grew a set of teeth. And then you lost them and you gave them to the tooth fairy. And then what ended up happening is you grew a second set of teeth. Problem is, if you lose one of those teeth, it doesn't regrow, unless if you become a lawyer or a shark. The core of this thing, the interesting thing is, your body knows how to make teeth. Your body's done it twice. Why can't it do so a third time? And by the way, every one of your cells, with the exception of some blood cells, contains your entire human genome. So the entire operating code to build every part of your body is in each of your cells. And in the measure that you understand, execute this or execute that, you regrow your skin when you get a sunburn. Or you regrow your bone when you break a bone. But that same code knows how to make a liver, and a stomach, and an eye, which is why Tony's working on about 32 different organs right now and has implanted bladders, and has implanted tracheas. And what's going to start happening is we're going to start regrowing our body parts on a consistent basis. We're going to become a little bit like our houses. You keep renewing the house, you change the windows, you swap out the furnace. It's the same house, but you'll just keep upgrading it. And of course, we may modify some of this stuff. Because what Craig and Ham Smith are working on is programmable cells. So you take a cell, you take the entire gene code out of that cell, you put a new gene code into it, and you make it a different species. So that's a little bit like taking your iPhone and putting a bunch of apps on it, except this happens to be a cell, and then you put a bunch of apps on that, and it'll make energy, it'll store information, or it'll make proteins, or it'll make this, and that is going to be the biggest single driver of the global economy going forward. That's the reason why Exxon just announced a partnership with Synthetic Genomics to drive commercial scale production of fuels by 2025 on an almost carbon neutral basis. George Church, another spectacular guy. Right? He's thinking about how do you engineer an entire human genome into cells. He's thinking about how do you take the gene code out of a frozen woolly mammoth, and working with Stuart Brand and UCSB, how do you execute that gene code again and give birth to the first mammoths that we've seen since Egyptian times? So this whole revive and restore program just takes DNA and begins to execute it. And you're beginning to see these bridges. And at first nothing happens, and at second nothing happens, and at third nothing happens. And there's decades where nothing happens, and then there's weeks where decades happen, as the old buddy Lenin used to say. So we can do it. Would we actually want to do it? Does it make any sense to engineer the human body? Why would we do that? Well, the Astronomer Royal of Great Britain has a wonderful phrase, right? So the universe is 100% malevolent, but only 80% effective. The human body is a really lousy thing for almost all of the universe. You take a human being, you put it in space, dead. Put it on Mars, dead. Put it on Venus, dead. Put it on the moon, dead. So there's this little tiny eddy where our particular biology can coexist. And meteorites and asteroids are nature's way of asking, how's your space program going? Because we've had at least 5 major extinctions on this planet. And a supernova or a solar flare or a black hole or a whole bunch of other stuff, game over. Extinction actually turns out to be common and natural. 99% of species on this planet have gone extinct. 32 predecessors to us, at least, have gone extinct. There's little traces of them. You're all 2% Neanderthal, unless if you're of African descent. A little higher in Washington. But it's pretty safe to say the human species could go extinct at some point. And that means it's imperative to diversify our species. Because if we don't do that, we won't be able to live here or on any of the other exoplanets. To get to these exoplanets requires some pretty extreme engineering. Voyager 1 went out there for 6 billion kilometers. So re-engineering a body has to be a very, very different body to live on a different planet. And that's something we can do, because Floyd Romsberg is doing things like re-engineering the human body, putting in a different genetic code. And if we can re-engineer the body, then the question becomes, what about the brain? Because I'm pretty sure by your kids' time, we're going to be able to remake all of our bodies. Can you transplant a mouse head from one place to another? Why is that so important? Because if this mouse goes to Minnie Mouse and it still remembers how to navigate the maze, it still remembers it loves Minnie Mouse, it still remembers it likes this food, it still remembers it's afraid of that, then you can transplant memories. And then the only question is the only input-output system in your body. Or could you download that to something else? Because you know you can reproduce your whole body, but can you transplant the thoughts? If you can do that, then longevity becomes a very different timescale. If you can't do that, then you may be able to reproduce your body, but your memories are going to hold you back. If you can transplant your memories, then this picture gets really important. This is the most important selfie ever taken by our species. 6 billion kilometers away, that little circle is us. All of us. Something happens to that circle, humans and all their descendants are gone. And so the reason you really do want to re-engineer the human body is because eventually you want to be able to say, that's us, and that's us, and that's us, and diversify the risk. Because if you don't diversify the risk, we're gone. And so the bottom line on this is it's actually unethical not to think about evolving the human body. We have always been explorers. We've always been discoverers. Let's get a little bit more ambitious. Let's leave the current debates behind and let's start thinking not just about how do we get to Mars. Let's think about how we get to some real exploration. And I hope my grandkids see that. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Juan. The idea of crowdsourcing. Could you get anyone in the world who you don't even know working for you? When I think of really who invented it, it was Peter Diamandis. The idea of an XPRIZE where people could focus on competing hundreds or thousands of people to solve a problem that you've identified, whether it's Singularity University, his creativity in bringing science forward from the future, assembling teams of people from around the world who never knew each other to solve a problem. Peter, two books that changed my thinking were a book called Abundance and Bold. And as Peter pointed out, we're going from evolution by natural selection, Darwinism, into evolution by intelligent direction. As we step back and think of those 4 steps once again, humans today, humans incorporating technology into our body and our brains, which we've been seeing in science fiction for decades. Humans becoming massively connected with each other, and billions of AI applications. And lastly, humans traveling to other planets in search of life and in search of alternative places for us to live. Peter Diamandis.
Thank you, Mike. An honor to be here, and an honor to follow Dr. Enriquez. Good afternoon. I'm clear that we are alive during the most extraordinary time ever in human history. There's no better time to be alive. In our lifetime, we're going to see what was once considered miracles happen, and then we're going to take them completely for granted, which is extraordinary. People, all of us, I think, truly have no idea how fast the world is changing. And it's changing because of a fundamental force of nature, if you would, which is computational power. This is Gordon Moore, one of the founders of Intel, who in 1958 starts this company. 7 years later, in 1965, publishes a very famous paper. He says, we've noticed something. Over the last 7 years, the number of transistors on a piece of silicon per dollar has roughly doubled every 12 to 18 months. And then he said, and it's likely to continue. And has for 50 years. We call that Moore's Law. But I want to give you context about how fast the world is changing. This is Intel's first, if you would, integrated circuit, a horizontal and a vertical transistor. Back in 1958, they founded the company on this. Fast forward to their first commercial product in 1971, the Intel 4004, 2300 transistors, about $1 each. Now, let's go to the Core i7, 14.4 billion transistors, less than a millionth of a penny each. It's a 330 billion-fold price performance increase that we think nothing of, right? How many of you have like a dozen old cell phones in your drawer? I know I do, right? And they were military secrets 20 years ago that the KGB and CIA would have probably stormed your house for. Let's look at another way of looking at this. In 1956, this was a 5-megabyte hard drive. $120,000, and if you happen to have your cargo airplane, you could move it from office to office. We noticed when this happened, right, where now it's 25 times more memory for 1,000 times cheaper. But did we notice when this happened, when now it's 1,000 times more for the same price? Right on schedule on Moore's Law, 9 years later. But it doesn't stop there, right? Today, it's a terabyte for something you can lose in your pocket. I did the calculation this morning. It's a 10 trillion-fold price performance volume increase. And again, this is the oxygen we live in, and we don't really fully understand the miraculous world that we're living in. This is from my business partner Ray Kurzweil's book, The Singularity is Near, and it shows computational power between 1900 and 2010. And I'm sure there's a lot of mathematicians in the room here, and on a log scale, an exponential should be a straight line. But this is curving upwards, which tells us the first derivative is positive, the rate at which computers are getting faster is itself getting faster. But besides that, look at this. You can't see World War I or World War II or recessions or boom times, right? We're using faster computers to build faster computers, and it's proceeding without slowing down. And when it does, you get this. 2023, was that 5 years from now, $1,000 is now buying you the computational power of the human brain, 10 to the 16 cycles per second. And 25 years later, now $1,000 is buying you the computational power of the entire human race. Now your kid's homework gets really easy. But it doesn't stop there, right? 2018 is the year we're going to see quantum supremacy, which is just a fancy name for the first time that a quantum computer is showing without question that it can solve a problem that no classical computer can solve. And as we see companies like Google and IBM and Rigetti and probably countless labs in China moving forward on this, these quantum computers are going to provide a revolution in material sciences, allowing us to predict the material's genome and materials that have kinds of properties we dream of but don't have yet. Imagine small teams, maybe individuals, using quantum computers to discover new molecules and doing drug trials on N of 1 that happens to be a millionfold in a quantum computer, or machine learning. If you thought things were fast, hold on. So ultimately, these faster, cheaper computers are the oxygen in the room. They're the foundation upon which all these other technologies are growing. And it's not just any one of these that's changing the world. It's the combination of 2, 3, 4 of these, creating these new business models. And this is what's accelerating and driving us. So the implications of these exponential technologies, which have been going on for some time. So what's happened in the last 100 years? First of all, we are going from a world of scarcity to abundance. There is nothing truly scarce. Right? Global income over the last century has tripled, lifespan has doubled, we're about to double it again. Food has dropped 20-fold in price, energy has dropped hundreds of fold. We've seen literally literacy explode on the planet, transportation costs dropping precipitously, communications, knowledge growing globally, where literally a child in the middle of Tanzania on a smartphone on Google has access to the same information as Larry Page at Alphabet, a complete dematerialization, demonetization, and democratization of knowledge that we don't think anything about. And we're also living during the most peaceful time ever in human history. It's the work of Steven Pinker at Harvard that blows people's minds. We are amazingly lucky to be living today. But what about the next, not century, the next 30 years? And I think this is what blows me away of how much things are going to change, not during your kid's lifetime, during our lifetime. So looking at just a few of these. The first is connecting the world. In the next year, we're about to start deploying the 5G global networks, right? The work that Qualcomm has done, where your digital devices are going to be connecting at 10 to 100 gigabit connection speeds. Imagine being able to download a video, a movie, in a fraction of a second. But it's not just that, right? Facebook is deploying drones and satellites, Google with balloons and satellites, Greg Weiler, Richard Branson, Paul Jacobs with $1.2 billion of SoftBank's money deploying 900 satellites around the world. But if that's not enough, you've got SpaceX with their Starlink deploying a 4,425 satellite constellation next year. And, oh, by the way, that's not enough, so they're deploying another layer of 7,000 satellites. Here's what's going on right here, which blows my mind and no one's talking about, that is going to change the world. We're going from, oops. I always say AI is easy, AV is hard. 2010, 8 years ago, 1.8 billion people connected on planet Earth. Last year, 3.8. In the next 5 to 7 years, we're about to connect an additional 4.2 billion people. 4.2 billion new minds that have never been connected are coming online in the next 5 to 7 years, right? What are they going to desire, create, invent, upload, download, buy? Tens of trillions of dollars flowing into the global economy that no one's talking about. They're all entrepreneurs. They're coming online at gigabit connection speeds, not like you and I did on AOL at 9.6 baud. So, it's not just people. We're about to connect everything, right? In 2020, the prediction is 50 billion connected devices. with 1 trillion sensors. Fast forward to 2030, 500 billion connected devices with 100 trillion sensors, where you're going to be able to know anything you want, anytime you want, anywhere you want. I teach my kids, it's not what you know, it's the questions you ask. It's far more important. And besides our things, it's our brains. Right? So today we've got Brian Johnson, Elon Musk, Facebook, Google, IBM, BrainGate. We've got Mary Lou Jepsen, DARPA, I'm sure countless companies, organizations in China and Russia rushing to connect the brain with the cloud. Why? Because there's nothing more important. Your ability to increase your intelligence 1,000,000-fold, your memory 1,000,000,000-fold, your ability to create a connection of the neocortex of your brain, billions of dollars being invested in right now. The prediction was 2045. Ray Kurzweil, a friend, a mentor for me who has been speaking about this, his prediction is the mid-2030s. So what's the world like? Let me do the calculation here. That's sort of like, not too far from now, 17 years from now, when we're connecting the human brain with the cloud. What does it mean when you think and you Google instantly? We also have today an implication of exponentials to empower small teams. I teach us at Singularity University, the world's biggest problems are the world's biggest business opportunities. Want to become a billionaire? Help 1 billion people. So the number of people able to go and find and solve problems is exploding. The way I've had the pleasure to do that with a number of you in the audience is to ask the world to solve the problem. So we've launched about $150 million of XPRIZes, another $200 million in development. But we're asking teams right now to transform every single industry. Elon Musk funded a $15 million global learning XPRIZE. Take a child in the middle of no place, from illiteracy to reading, writing, numeracy on their own in 18 months. We had 700 teams enter. We're in testing with 2,000 kids in 141 villages in Tanzania with an Android app that takes them to be able to read on their own. An avatar XPRIZE. Create a robotic avatar that you can put on VR goggles, a haptic suit, and effectively Uber your consciousness into it. So you can enter a nuclear power plant or go into a burning house or go and diagnose somebody. We've got a water XPRIZE, asking teams to pull 2,000 liters of water out of the humidity of the air and give it to a village for 2 cents a liter. Or we've got a carbon XPRIZE, take the CO2 out of the smokestacks and make them into something more valuable than the cost of extracting the CO2 at temperature, pressure, and concentration. Another implication of exponentials happening right now is longevity. At the end of the day, my mission and a lot of people who I work with is to make 100 years old and you 60. How do we add 20 or 30 healthy years on every single person's life? There's no bigger business opportunity, no bigger boon to the economy than to keep all of you working at the peak of your performance instead of, going off to a farm someplace. I've had the chance to start 2 companies, HLI and Singularity, or co-found, but there's amazing companies from Unity Biosciences, United Therapeutics, Moderna, Elevian, Editas, Samumed, billions of dollars going in. And to quote a friend, Ray Kurzweil, we're reaching towards a longevity escape velocity. What does that mean? Ray predicts it to be a point in time, or defines it to be a point in time where for every year that you're alive, science is extending your life for more than a year. So the prediction of when, that's 12 years from now, at least in his mind. So the goal here is don't die from something stupid in the end run. We're also heading towards becoming a multi-planetary species. Right here, right now. Whatever we evolve into 1,000,000 years from now, we're going to look back at these next few decades as the moment in time where the human race moved out of the planet Earth, just like the first lungfish moved out of the oceans onto land. Moon, Mars, free space, other star systems we'll see. It's been a race these last 2 years between Elon and Jeff. Jeff, the wealthiest human, on record at least, has committed $1 billion a year. Elon has made it his personal quest. He's he will spend every single dollar he has to get the human race off the planet. What we're seeing is amazing. In the upper left over there, we have 5 venture-backed startups building rockets. That never existed before. But the real action is here. You've got Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy on the left, the most extraordinary launch vehicles today, and then Jeff Bezos, not to be outdone by Elon, has been building larger rockets, the New Glenn second and third stage, and of course, not to be outdone by Jeff, Elon's announced the BFR, it gets even bigger. Boys and their toys. But the reality is everything we've ever held of value, metals, minerals, energy, real estate, is in near infinite quantities in space. And to echo what my colleague Juan has said, is it's a moral and ethical imperative for us to make ourselves a multiplanetary species. It's happening right here, right now. I'm going to close with a historical view of what I call turning us into a meta-intelligence. And I decided, what the hell, I'll go full out. Because it sounds a little crazy. But I think nature repeats itself over and over again. So if you look at the story of life, life began about 4 billion, 3.5 billion with early prokaryotic cells, simple bags of cytoplasm and free-floating DNA. And then over the course of the next, so we say, billion years, these cells began to incorporate technology into them. Mitochondria, endoplasmic reticulum, Golgi apparatus, nuclear membranes, and they became able to process information and energy more efficiently. This was the first step of becoming highly complex life forms. The second step was this. When eukaryotic cells, instead of being loners, individuals, became, if you would, multicellular. The collaboration of these cells coming together. And then the third step in this process is when we've gone from very simple multicellular to you and I today. 10 trillion cells working together and evolving intelligence. And my belief is that we're going to play this same thing out in the next 30 years. What's that look like? Number one, we're beginning through BCI, those companies we showed, the work that Juan Enriquez and his colleagues have been doing, to begin to incorporate technology into our brain. Imagine being able to connect your brain to the cloud. The next step after that is then literally the collaboration between ourselves. It's creating a multicellular version of ourselves and ultimately becoming conscious at a new level, what I would call a meta-intelligence. I want you to imagine the ability to connect to another mind any place on the planet, to connect to 100,000 minds, to 1,000,000 minds, to know their feelings, their thoughts, their knowledge. And then once you've had that, to disconnect yourself, and how lonely it would feel. Imagine a world in which all of us are connected at a level like never before. You are a connection of 100 trillion cells in your body, every one of them alive, every one of them you. At the end of the day, for me, this is truly the most extraordinary time ever to be alive. A time where we're going from dreams to reality faster than ever before. I love sharing my work. If you'd like these slides, you can just email slides@diamandis.com and they'll get downloaded to you. Anyway, an honor and a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Peter. While we reset the stage, just a couple comments. Have we heard about connecting people before? Yes, we can go back to Star Trek. May the Force be with you. Connecting knowledge. Have we thought about what these issues were before? Yes. What we didn't have was the power. The files were too large, trillions of cells. We needed computers that increased their speed 1,000,000, 1,000,000,000-fold. We needed to be able to hold data. We needed the cost to go to zero, and as Peter has projected, ultimately we need a way that will eventually connect to everyone on the planet. So to take a look at what these technologies are going to do, I'd like to ask Peter and Juan to come back and join me on the stage. Thank you, Juan.
Thank you.
All right, so we all get ourselves and everyone in the audience at the same level. I thought, Juan, in your book, Involving Ourself, you share the unlikely story about how CRISPR came to be. Tell us the origin of CRISPR and tell us a little bit about it. We've had gene therapy around for 3 decades, but CRISPR is something different. What's special about CRISPR, Juan?
So CRISPR is one in a long set of editing tools. So if you imagine the first word processors, you know, they used to be the little whiteout, and then you'd type over it, and then it became these really awkward machines, and then it became these really simple machines. So CRISPR is one of a long line, and the weird thing is it was discovered by yogurt makers, because they were trying to figure out why some batches got contaminated and others didn't. And it turns out that you can take mug shots of the things that are bad for you. And then a whole series of very smart people like Jennifer Doudna and Feng Zhang and Charpentier came up with a tool that almost makes it like a Lego block to edit. And that's going to be superseded very quickly by the ability to just print entire genomes. And those are actually machines that we're now shipping as desktop machines. So you won't be editing sentences, you'll be writing entire books.
So if we step back, in Star Trek Deep Space Nine in the mid-1990s, the precautionary principle says we should not proceed down perilous scientific paths unless we have certainty that they will not cause human harm. How do we control the power that is available to us today, Peter?
So I don't think we can, at least not by edict or by regulatory, and let me expand that a little bit. We're living in a world of porous borders. A country makes something illegal or regulates against it. The scientists, the data, the software can easily move someplace else. We saw that when embryonic stem cell research was defunded. We went from #1 in the United States to like #8, and the scientists and the money and so forth went overseas. I think what worked really well, I remember I was at MIT at the Whitehead Institute when restriction enzymes were first coming out, and there was a lot of conversations around Hitler Youth and designer babies and all kinds of, you know, the amygdala in us creates all of the worst possible scenarios. And what occurred was, rather than regulate against it, the community came together and self-organized at the Asilomar conferences and said, this is what we're going to voluntarily set up as our protocols. And I think that has worked, and there's similar efforts going on in AI right now, which is the current boogeyman in that regard. But I think what gives me the greatest amount of hope is that we're living in a world of high, what I call, you know, hyper-transparency, where it's really hard to do something in hiding. A world of, a trillion sensors, 100 trillion sensors, everything's being digitized. And so I'm counting on AI to work on my side and not the other person's side. But I don't think we can stop it. I also wonder if you had gone back to Einstein and you said, listen, this equation here, equal mc squared, it's going to lead to the nuclear bomb. Stop thinking about it. Could he have? Would he have? Or would someone else just pick it up a few months later?
So, understanding CRISPR technology, we have to assume, if not today, high school students interested will understand it. It's hard to believe a parent on this planet might not want to see if they can enhance the intelligence of their child, the height, the speed, their strength, etc. We didn't have the same technology available today. You know, if we think back to those Terminator movies, you had $4 million, okay, silicon graphics machines. Now you could do it on a handheld device. So how do you not have individuals on this planet, if this technology becomes so readily available, who don't want to enhance their children? Juan?
So let's try a very strange thought experiment. Bring your grandparents back, sit them in front of you, and let's have a birds and the bees conversation with your grandparents. But you brought them back in a time machine. They're 18 years old. They're sitting in front of you, and you're going to explain sex to them. Rooms get very quiet at this point. And if you do that, they knew about reproduction because they were usually married at age 18. But they didn't know that you could separate sex from conception, because for all of human history, sex usually equaled conception, and we've now separated those two. And then we're going to tell them, oh, by the way, it turns out that you can do in vitro fertilization, which means two bodies never have to come together. And they'd say, you know, we've heard about that. That was the Immaculate Conception, wasn't it? And you're now telling me you do that every day. And oh, by the way, you can freeze embryos and have a surrogate mother and have identical twins born 50 years apart with today's technology. And at that point, your grandparents get up and think, this kid's been smoking something. So things that we consider normal, our grandparents would have thought of as miraculous and superpowers. Now go back to Mike's question. What are our grandkids going to take for granted with all these technologies that to us would seem absolutely miraculous and strange and weird and scary? Because it's going to accelerate, and they're going to take it for granted.
Peter?
I would say, I completely agree. I also would say our ethics and our morals change. I was just at the Vatican this week. We had an XPRIZE adventure trip for our benefactors, and we're having this debate around extreme longevity. And I was saying, you know, if we went back 2,000 years ago to my great-great-great-great-grandparents in Greece, and somebody was dying from cardiomyopathy, and someone else got gored by a bull, and I took the dead man's heart and transplanted it, I would have been burned at the stake. Today, it's a miracle. And so we just have to realize that things are changing. The most difficult thing is these kinds and levels change historically at a much more slower rate, but they're about to begin to change at an extraordinary rate that society and governments, I don't think, will be able to really process. That's my biggest concern.
Let me just underline what you're saying. This is really important. We need an ethical moral framework for this stuff. We need guideposts for this stuff. But 99% of religions have gone extinct. That's why you go to museums and you see the god of corn and the god of this and Zarathustra and yada, 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 right? Religions that don't evolve and adapt alongside technology and help guide technology and also adapt to technology become irrelevant. Because sometimes you don't have to sacrifice a virgin for it to rain. And you move on, right? And we really do have to have this debate about ethics and morals and thought processes, because this is really powerful stuff. I mean, this is dominating life code. And that's why it's so important for everybody to be in this conversation, not just scientists.
Well, with 8 billion people on the planet and the potential, let's just take a small number, 100 million fully understand CRISPR technology and editing. Are you telling us that you believe the ethical issues here can be controlled, and not one of those 100 million people don't want their children to be stronger, taller, smarter, not just eliminate disease-driven genes?
So there were millions and millions of plastic surgery procedures in the United States last year. And the rumor is not all of them happened for strictly medicinal needs.
Welcome to Beverly Hills.
Our natural instinct is to want to make our kids and ourselves faster, stronger, better, right? And it's the motto of the Olympics. And nobody should be forced to do that. Nobody should do it in a way that harms other people, which is why germline engineering is different from engineering yourself, because it's different when you engineer the next generations, and we have to be very careful about that, right? We have to separate those two concepts. But we are a species that loves to explore. We're a species that has evolved over time. We're a species that's going to continue to evolve over time. And there'll be countries that say, all natural. And there'll be countries that say Yahoo, and there'll be everything in between. And that's okay.
And it's going on now. I mean, let's not fool ourselves. First of all, it's going on by who you select as your mate, whether they're pretty or wealthy or tall or short. We're doing that selective process now. And as a dad, I've got 2 boys that are turned 7 next year. I think about this. Of course, you want to give them the best education, the best food, the best clothing, the most everything. Well, why wouldn't you start first with the best genetics if you could? And is that ethically and morally wrong? I don't know. It changes.
Okay, I think we'll stay tuned. I think what I would put forth that both of you have spoken about is this is different. Yes, the human species has evolved. We have blue eyes and other things that have occurred over time, mutations. But I think, as you've said, Peter, and I quoted you today, we now have something that we know if we do this, this will happen, rather than just a natural evolution of mutations that have occurred. And therefore, one has to assume that new species are on the potential to be created over the next few years with this technology. And we have to assume that U.S. that's been relatively slow in adapting a technology that was developed here, that other nations might not have necessarily the same discipline from that standpoint. And we don't know what an Olympics will be 10 or 20 years from now. And we don't know if Star Trek Deep Space Nine has told us that you're not going to be in Starfleet if you've been genetically altered. Let's take a look at another challenge. 1 year ago, 2007, on this stage, Uri Milner and his team said it was a human imperative to perpetuate our species. If something ever happened to Earth, probability greater than 0. And if something ever happened to our solar system, 1 of trillions. The fact that we ever existed would never be known unless we found a way to move, and there being our closest solar system. Both of you referred to it, but 4 million light years, we can't travel at that speed at this time. And so Uri and others are investing in making traveling maybe at 1/5 of the speed of light and getting there in 20 years and then taking it 4 years for it to get back. How imperative, and what do you see from an XPRIZE for us to go and perpetuate the human race? Peter, why don't you start, and Juan, why don't you add in?
I think this is the greatest evolution. It's the story of life on this planet. We began in the savannas of Africa, and we have not a genotype, but I would call a phenotype of an exploration gene, a need to explore, right? And it was that exploration gene, if you would, that caused us to move and further and diversify our species out of savannas to other niches and places so that we could not be destroyed. We were down to a clan of 100,000 at one point and could have been wiped out. And it's this continuous exploration. So I think about this, that it's right now, right here, our lifetimes, that we're going to become a multiplanetary species. I do not personally believe it's the governments that will do it. The risks are way too high for failure, the arguments of how to spend it that way, but I do believe it will be individuals. I do believe, Bezos will spend his fortune. I've known him for 35 years. Elon will spend his to make it happen, and I'm super happy that they're doing that. And then we begin. We begin what humans have done over and over and over again. It's yet another chapter anew.
Juan?
So there's a lot of problems. But this is the coolest single time to be alive any period in history, right? I mean, we all play this game about what would happen if you lived in the Renaissance. Your murder rates in Boston next to the bus station in the 1980s were about where Columbia was a decade ago. And as you're thinking about this stuff, we are moving at light speed. And it's just an incredible period because all of a sudden your kids can do genomics and they can do brain studies and they can do the next generation of the internet. And there's just this massive opportunity sitting out there. And opportunities to learn and opportunities to just do it, right? So the bottom line on this stuff, two things matter in life. It's Nike and Nissan. So just do it and enjoy the ride.
Okay, so we're closing with an ad for Nike. Just do it. I think what we've heard is, one, share the risk individuals. Obviously, the discovery of North America, the New World, financed, in that case, by Queen Isabella of Spain, eventually gave way to a stock market in Amsterdam and the East India Company and the West India Company sharing risk. The wealth of individuals around the world and the desire to explore will lead them to explore these two areas. We have addressed many different issues at the conference, hundreds of them over the last 4 days. This issue, what is the future of the human species with the power that's available to us today? And will we perpetuate the human species on Earth, on another planet? Are great, exciting roads for us to travel. And as Juan said it, we're just going to do it. Thank you very much for that.